thank you, Martin, and thank you for organizing this event. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Duncan Clark. There's another Duncan from China sitting back there. At one point, we had a one Duncan per city rules. Duncan ex-BBC and I were in different cities at different times. But I was for many years in China, 30 years. But when I was 18, I spent my first summer in Asia was in Tokyo. I long wanted to spend more time in Tokyo, and as of about 8 years ago, I'm spending a lot more time in Japan. So for those of you who know China, there's the gaijin, or for Japan, the gaijin are the foreigners in Japan, and the WWII are the Chinese in China. I'm in the conversion going from the WWII to the gaijin, and some of us here have spent time also in China, then Japan. But the focus is Japan, because actually for the longest time, pretty much the last 30 years, China as an economic and technology power has been rising. But of course, things are changing a little bit at the moment. And Japan for the longest time was known as flyover country, that investors and tech people would fly over Japan to do their stuff in Hong Kong and China and so on. But the world is changing, and we're going to be talking today about Japan out of the shadows. And it is the 80th anniversary soon of the bombing of Hiroshima, featured very prominently on the stage permanently. This was not for today's event. I'm actually born on August 6th, which is the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. So it's, I remember that date. But basically, we're going to be talking about why Japan is in the headlines again for different reasons. And we have a great panel today. I'll start. Rupert, Wingfield-Hayes, and as I said, you were in the China to Japan conversion program, and then actually Taiwan after that, with BBC for 26 years with the BBC, and recently left the BBC. Last month. So we have two journalists on the panel actually. I'll start with the other journalist over there, Takehiro. You can call him Hiro, who's actually from Fukuoka in southwest Japan. Is actually fluent in Chinese, as well as his native Japanese, English, and Bahasa, because he spent time in Singapore. So he's a quadrilingual expert, has been writing for Caixin, the Chinese publication, for many years, and has a fantastic new book out called Run Re, or Run Li. He has a copy, not available in English yet. It's about Run to Japan, and I'll let him explain what that is, the Run to Japan. And then Tomoo Masutomo is a professor at Waseda University, and actually the three of us are in a new institute that Tomoo has created called Japan in the Global Economy, JGE, which just launched. Waseda University in Tokyo, which has a very proud history, and we'll hear about that. And he's the macroeconomist in the room, so he can give us the context of what's happening in the economy. And Jennifer Rogers and I also, we served on the board of another university in Japan, Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. But Jennifer has been in Japan for 20 years? 20 years, is fluent in Japanese. We're going to be talking about not just about the role of women in Japan, but it's an important lacuna, basically, and the way in which it is changing. But Jennifer has a lot of experience, both in her own, in Assyria, in the company she represents, but also on a number of boards from previously 7&I, which is 7-Eleven, currently Mitsubishi,
Mitsubishi
Sumitomo Bank, and also Kawasaki Heavy Industry. So, so you have a breadth of experience here from economists, journalists, business people, whatever I do, a lot of investing stuff. And here we go. So I'm going to kick off, I think, with our Japanese colleagues. So a professor, Tomoo, so an expert on the Japanese economy and the macroeconomy. And as I said, you've spent time, you actually grew up partly in Germany, you lived in Singapore a long time, you're a very international Japanese person. By the way, the bad joke I'll get out of the way, I'm 56, but if you want to feel younger, just go to Japan. These are young guys. I'm young in Japan, it's the best way you can. It's very depressing to go to Singapore, or Cambodia or Vietnam, where everybody's like 12. Japan, as we know, is aging. We'll be talking about that. But these two gentlemen are, dynamic, multilingual, and here. So please, first, what do you think, is Japan coming out of the shadows? Firstly, should we question this title, Japan Out of the Shadows? Is that a projection, or is that something real?
Yes, I think Japan is coming out of the woods. Japanese economy is no longer in a deflationary state. Inflation is picking up. New graduates from universities are receiving much higher salary than the previous generations of graduates. So the general wages have also gone up. I think the biggest change with inflation is that in Japan, one of the characteristics of household financial asset is that more than 50% of them are in cash or deposit. Also, one of the characteristics of Japanese corporation is that they've been first going overseas more and more due to yen appreciation and series of trade war. I mean, we still have trade war.
Trade
now,
wars
obviously.
ongoing. In fact, Trump just announced some
Ongoing.
tariff levels.
But the problem of those three decades was basically lack of demand. And why was there lack of demand? Because the real wage did not grow. Starting in mid-90s, almost for 30 years, there was no growth in real wage. But that's, and Japanese companies have been making record profits year after year. So the question is, what are they doing with that profit? Most of them, again, they're accumulating cash. So in the form of retained earnings. So the biggest thing that inflation is doing is that pressuring households as well as farms to spend their money more wisely, more productively. And the Japanese government's also policy is now focused on how to channel these savings into more productive investment.
And there was a good piece, I think, by Leo Lewis at the Financial Times. We knew him at the Times in China before. Again, another Laowai becoming a gaijin, although I think his wife is Japanese.
He went from gaijin to Laowai.
That's right. He went to
back to gaijin.
yeah, James King. There's a lot of journalists who've gone through the conversion program, but he had a good piece called sort of removing the sticking plaster. That Japan, real change is now happening because a lot of elderly people are going to die in the next 15 years, leaving huge amounts of savings and to younger, obviously, people who may invest very differently than they did. And also we see a lot of companies, right? Family-owned companies now. Maybe the children don't want to take them on, right? So we're seeing a profound change in M&A and all that. So that's some of the financial stuff. It's important because it shows the shadows are different now. I mean, the Japanese economy is moving out of a stasis it was stuck in for decades. So maybe on demography, because I think we should cover that. So what are your views on Japan's aging versus, say, Korea or other countries? Because it's not everywhere. Many countries in the Northern Hemisphere are facing this.
Just briefly on demography. I mean, you may be surprised to know, but Japan, in terms of total fertility rate, is actually not as bad as many other countries in East Asia. Japan is 1.2. Even China is now lower than Japan. Singapore is lower than Japan. Singapore is lower than 1 now. Taiwan is lower than Japan. South Korea is the worst, has a world record of 0.75. If you just look at the capital city Seoul, it's even 0.5.
Wow.
Right. So Japan, of course, one of the major, I think, contributor on the supply side for the last decades was declining population. But you could say that Japan has managed the transition relatively well, and it took much longer time for aging and declining population. I think what the other countries in Asia are going to face is because they developed much faster, the aging is going to be faster and population decline is going to be faster than Japan too. So yeah.
Japan just revealed, I think it was 680,000 babies were born last year. So on average, Japanese population is shrinking almost at 1 million a year, 950, something like that.
Yeah.
And then we're going to introduce Hiro now because we can't call it, Japanese don't like to talk about immigration, but as somebody once told me, Japan has a very good immune system in terms of migration or immigration. But whether you call it guest workers or worker permits, which are extended, we are seeing 350, I think 400,000 a year people from outside Japan moving to Japan. If you go to the convenience stores, the famous konbini, in Tokyo, you won't see Japanese people there at all. Actually, a lot from South Asia, training them up. And Jennifer was on the board of 7 and I. We can talk about that. But Hiro, so of these people coming into Japan every year, China is quite a big chunk. And you've written the book. So here, tell us about Runli or Runru. Run to Japan.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you know what this means, Runli. So Run basically means escape or emigrate, or even to have better life outside, abroad. So, and then Ri means Japan. So Runli actually means Chinese people escaping from China to Japan. Yeah, and the number of Runli has been, increasing first over the past few years, especially after following the Shanghai lockdown in 2022. Many Chinese people think, China's economic, social, and even political situation deteriorating. So that's why they are arriving in Tokyo.
And Japan is pretty open, right? I mean,
Yeah.
to get a residence permit to buy
Yeah,
land, there's no
it's really,
restrictions.
really-
So Chinese have been taking advantage or benefiting from the fact it is quite open.
That's right. So I interviewed more than maybe 100 of newcomers from China, but yeah, they all say it was really easy to get a long-term visa. So for example, like to apply for this business manager visa, you need to establish a company, but you only need to inject just 5 million yen. So it's something like what?
Divide by 100 and $40,000. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really, yeah.
It's much cheaper
Kind
than a
of
European
nothing.
golden visa, right?
Yeah.
If there are any left.
Yeah. So
Oh, something behind us. Yeah. But so we have seen this. Oh, it's the air conditioning. I mean, we have a guest from Beijing or something. Sorry. So one thing in your book that you make very clear is that the traditional emigration of Chinese to Japan were people often from Fujian province in the southeast, where if you go, for example, Nagasaki and other places, there's a lot of links with that province of Fujian, or
Right.
northeast China, which also had historical links, controversially
Yeah.
with Japan. But the new wave, a lot of them
yeah.
are coming from places like, even like Beijing, Shanghai, and they're
Correct.
coming with money. They're not coming to work in a
So
convenience
that's
store.
really
Yeah.
distinctive,
Mhm.
in characteristics. And so like it includes like super rich, like
Right.
Jack Ma of Alibaba, and
So I wrote a book about Jack Ma,
yes.
but he wrote, in his book, he has pictures of the, is it in the book as well? Or, no, it's in your slide presentation. He has pictures of many homes that Jack Ma owns in Japan, across Japan. I was surprised, in Hokkaido, in Kyoto. So that's an example of the super rich from China who have found, at least part of the year, a home in Japan.
Yes,
And
and
they're
many
big.
many other Chinese executives, they have some sort of real estate,
Right.
in Tokyo.
And one interesting aspect, so some Chinese, when they move to Japan, eventually they can naturalize within sort of 5 years, maybe get a passport. But some of them choose not to use the Chinese character of their name in Japanese, but actually reinvent themselves. And some of them speak very good Japanese, and they will kind of disappear within. So your book, I mean, it's had a real impact. It's in its 8th printing or 7th printing. It's been on the national news because a lot of Japanese didn't quite realize how many Chinese are actually amongst them. But also in, for example, in technology and science, like at Tokyo University, which is the most prestigious university after Waseda, some 60% or something of PhDs in technology are actually Chinese.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about the reaction you've had to the book from government, from the media, and we have these elections coming up as well.
Right. So I started to write my book around late 2023. And at the time, I thought, this new wave of Chinese immigrants arriving in Japan should be really discussed at national level. And finally, people started to realize, this is really a huge phenomenon, having a huge impact on Japanese economy, society, even politics, and yeah. So actually, so Japan will have an upper house election in 2 weeks' time, and it's becoming really like a real, point of discussion.
Who is the Japanese Nigel Farage? Or there are several. Are there like Brexity, Jexity people emerging? Not that they can exit from. I mean, but you would say the new party is called.
Sanseito.
Sanseito.
It's maybe not really covered by global media yet, but just over a few weeks, past few weeks, this new party called Sanseito became really, really popular and is projected to win many seats in the upper house. And this is really remarkable. I mean, I would say this is going to be political tsunami for Japan. And Sanseito, I think it's maybe in the in the UK, maybe similar to Reform UK, and in German, it's
AFD.
Yeah, AFD. So they are really anti-immigrants and also anti-globalization, and yeah. So this anti-globalization, anti-immigration wave finally reached Japan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe
alarming.
next to Jennifer, and then we'll focus a little bit on some of the geopolitical and military aspects as well, because I know you. Somehow I remember you on a ship, on an aircraft carrier, reporting on this, but I don't want to reduce you to that, but we need to talk about the geopolitics of the region. But I think, Jennifer, before that, to your experience, you've been living in Japan for 20 years, you speak fluent Japanese, you're on boards. What do you see changing in terms of these shadows? Are we over calling it, or?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that, I think that geopolitics now is really your number one risk that you talk about at boards. And I think what's happened with the China de-risking in particular is that Japan has become much more of a place for people to invest, right? I think you're looking at now, actually what's interesting is it's the second most active market for activists, in the sense that you have much more proactive investment flows happening in Japan. And I think to a large degree, that is due to the focus of Japan as more of a stable place to invest. You also have companies that have high cash holdings, kind of underperforming or low PBR. So they're undervalued. So I think you also have a confluence of a lot of different factors that are coming into why Japan now is sort of trendy from an investor perspective. So I think that, that's been happening. I think the other thing that's been happening too is that as we see the sort of the population decline in Japan too, I think there's more opportunities actually for foreigners. I think that Japan is becoming more open to foreign investment too, as Japanese companies are looking outside the Japanese market to actually grow their investments. I mean, all the companies I sit on or have sat on are large, but the realities for most of the major Japanese corporations is more than 50%, sometimes even 70% of their earnings are now overseas. And so as you get to better returns and you want to attract more foreign investors, what you're seeing is that you have more core asset divestitures. So you have more opportunities for private equity, the credit markets, as well as more active investors. I think at our luncheon conversation we had today, you mentioned Warren Buffett. He came in big and invested in all the Japanese trading companies who are kind of a value investment. I sat on the board of Mitsui and Company, which is one of the largest trading companies in Japan, and they have 16 different business units, anywhere from healthcare to energy. They do LNG. They have a variety of investments. It's almost like a natural hedge, a very vast portfolio. So Warren Buffett, he was 5%, now he's kind of less than 10%. So you've seen even significant investors that had never looked at Japan now shifting their income into Japan. So I think Japan is back on a lot of levels, and I do think a lot of that has been because of the geopolitical risk assessments that you're seeing even for now, I think the U.S. instability will, I think, increase the attractiveness of Japan as an investment market.
Yeah, and I know this from my apartment in Tokyo. I open the window, the curtains in the morning. I look at a U.S. military base. You know, having been previously in Beijing, and I see these like Black Hawk helicopters. It's a bit of a jarring thing. But you know, the U.S. military presence, both of course in Okinawa, but across the islands. You know, let's talk about this on the geopolitics, and then we get to more fun stuff like tourism and culture, because I think that's also part of this reawakening of the world to Japan. But you've covered it for a long time. You were in 10 years in Tokyo,
10 years, yeah.
and then you were in Taipei until recently.
Yeah.
So, what's your assessment of where we're heading?
I was going to say,
Please, any other topic you'd like.
well, I was just going to respond to what Hiro was saying, because he was saying that, you know, Japan is very cheap, and so foreigners find it very cheap, and you can buy property in Japan, and I'm one of those foreigners. So, you know, I have taken advantage of this, the weak yen and the easy availability and simplicity of buying property in Japan. And I now live part of the year in the mountains in central Japan, and I'm surrounded by an increasing number of people from all over the world. There's a lot of Australians, there's a lot of Singaporeans, but there are also many Chinese. And it's interesting to see that, you know, you talk about the different generations of Chinese who've come. So, you know, the guy I bought my snow clearing machine off and who maintains it for me is from Dongbei. He's from
Northeast
Heilongjiang.
China. Yeah.
So he's an old dude from Heilongjiang, and fabulous guy. And he came over 30 years ago, and he's naturalized, and his kids and grandkids have grown up in Japan. The guy who I sell my scrap metal to is from Shandong, and he's taken a Japanese name. In fact, you couldn't tell he was Japanese unless you...
Chinese.
Sorry, can't tell he's Chinese. I couldn't tell he was Chinese. My girlfriend said, I think he's Chinese, judging by his accent. So then I spoke to him in Chinese, and he turned, you know, he sort of...
10% off? No.
This white guy speaking to me in Chinese. But then, in the local cafe by the lake, run by a friend of mine, you will often run into groups of young, clearly wealthy Chinese people from Beijing and Shanghai. And if you ask them, oh, you know, I just say, well, where are you from in China? I hear you speaking Chinese. And they say, we're not from China. We live here. So, yes, I just to observe that I have noticed this phenomenon in the town that I spend quite a large chunk of the year in. And it's very interesting to see. But, of course, it comes with resentment. The talk of the town this year is the Singaporean company that has bought the local ski resort and one of the hotels beside the lake, and are going to put $1.5 billion into redeveloping the ski resort and building a 5-star hotel there. And this is a ski resort that we love because it's 40 euros a day to go skiing there, and it's got some of the best snow in the world. And we can be certain that once this Singaporean company has built its 5-star hotel and set it all up, that the prices are going to double or triple. So personally, that's upsetting.
Bloody Singaporeans.
But also,
But your property is also going down.
Yeah.
exactly. There's an upside to all this, I suppose. There's an upside to all of it. So that's just some personal observations. Do you want me to go back to the
You don't have to.
the geopolitical
You
stuff?
can go
I mean,
with it.
I spent a lot of my time, 10 years in Japan, with the U.S. Navy.
That's right. I mean, I'm not wrong in remembering you on
Well,
aircraft carriers.
because the 7th Fleet is based in Yokosuka, and of course the 3rd MEF, the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, is based in Okinawa. So, you know, America's deployment in the Western Pacific, Japan is absolutely the hub of America's power projection in Asia, and it remains so. I remember a very prominent Japanese politician saying to me once in the LDP, I said, do you think Japan's going to get aircraft carriers? And he said, we don't need one. We've got the USS Ronald Reagan sitting in Yokosuka. And that has been such a feature of the whole security of the Western Pacific since the end of the Second World War. And for the first time this year, I think that is in question, whether America's, particularly as extended nuclear deterrence, but also whether America is committed to protecting Japan's southern islands, certainly whether the United States Navy is committed to protecting Taiwan
Yes.
from invasion is now up to question. And Japan is, I mean, this is another remarkable thing that I saw during the 10 years I spent reporting, is that Japan is a pacifist nation, right? Has a pacifist constitution. And so it doesn't maintain a military, right? Well, Japan's Navy is considerably bigger than the Royal Navy. It has 23 attack submarines, around 25 destroyers, and now two small aircraft carriers, land attack cruise missiles. Japan has very serious military force. I think the big question going forward is
Self-defense force.
That's
Self-defense force.
self-defense force, and apparently it's not an aircraft carrier, it's a aircraft carrying destroyer or something along those lines. However, I mean, I think the real question now with what America's doing is Japan going to step into the breach and take more of a leadership role in the Western Pacific in counterbalancing China, as China's military is growing even faster. And, you know, one senses in Taiwan, because I think Taiwan is the key to the future of strategic landscape of the Western Pacific is, and I'll shut up after this, is if there is a crisis, you know, China's military power is growing at such a pace that America by itself can perhaps in the near future not hope to deter China by itself. So is Japan and you know, Korea and others, but primarily Japan, going to step up and really take a role in deterring China? And I think, you know, it's an open question. My feeling at the moment is no, right? I mean, politically, it's not
there yet.
it's not nearly there. Militarily, tactically, Japan is very, very capable, but politically, it strikes me that Japanese people are not mentally prepared to see their military take part in a war with China, or even in the prospect of a war with China.
Can I just add
Yes,
one
Sorry,
point
go
to
on.
this?
Yeah.
So I think what I understand what you just said, but there is also an aspect of, I think, Washington creating a threat or making a threat out of China. And I think Korea as well as Japan know that too. So I think that's why we do not probably perceive China as a military threat as the Pentagon would like to paint it, right? Because we know there is a big industrial complex and industrial interest involved in these too. So I think Japan would have a bit more nuanced approach than just trying to.
And on the Senkaku Islands, which is, you know, or the Diaoyudao, or the Sandwich Islands, I think, or there's another name for them anyway. The islands in the middle. Yeah, our name. Yeah, the original name. No. It's been a bit quieter recently, right? Obviously, there was that famous incident when, you know, a company, I guess, a Japanese company, wasn't it, acquired the islands, and they were about to acquire an island, and so Japan intervened, right, and then to have the response from Beijing. But it's been slightly.
Senkaku Islands, also known as the
Diaoyu Islands,
Diaoyudao,
aka Sandwich Islands.
They
Tokyo
also
government.
Yeah,
the
Pinnacle
were
Islands.
They were owned by a family
That's right.
for 100 years, and then Ishihara,
That's right.
the governor of Tokyo, was going to buy them off this family on behalf of Japan, and the then DPJ government, right? It was still the DPJ government in 2011, stepped in and nationalized them to try and neutralize the situation in their view.
How'd that work out?
Didn't work out very well. Didn't work out very well.
Nothing the DPJ really worked out.
Yeah, didn't work.
But my point is that recently we haven't heard so much. I think the number of incursions, or whatever you want to talk about it, describe it, has been lower than it had been. So it seems like, and China is also in some discussions with Japan and Korea on trade. So is there a divide and conquer approach going on? How successful will that be? I mean, if you're right that there is this natural resistance within Japan to accepting this as a threat, or recognizing it as a threat.
What do you mean? Natural resistance from?
Well, if Japan isn't going to follow along in terms of the US seeing this as such a big threat, I mean, they have passed legislation to double spending on defense.
I guess the most important thing is trying to avoid that some kind of contingency happens and then escalates into real war.
Right.
So that's the management part of this. But even I don't think it's in China's interest to fight a war with Japan.
Right. But we do see, obviously, with Taiwan, as you said, that's the key to it all, because obviously we do see Chinese aircraft carriers deploying beyond, you know, or actually passing through the the islands of
I mean,
Japan.
But it remains very controversial because of the Constitution, the pacifist Constitution. They haven't been able, Prime Minister Abe, before he passed away, wanted to revise that. And even though they doubled the spending, you still haven't shifted that mentality. So even the self-defense force, still can only be deployed for, assistance. There can't be any proactive, aggression. And so that is still a huge conflict within Japan and within the psyche, right? And I do think that while you maybe haven't seen a lot of incursions, the scramble, like the activity off Okinawa by like the Chinese are getting much more aggressive as the incursions into Japanese airspace are continuing. I don't think you've heard as much on the South Pacific Seas recently, but I just think maybe, and people speculate, that there's been a little bit more of less activity because of what happened in Iran. I don't know if that's true or not, if that's really, but I do think that you still have a huge psychological barrier, but even actually as a lawyer, a constitutional, barrier yet to Japan really becoming aggressive, right? And that even goes to the nuclear related, their ability to have an acceptance to any kind of nuclear warships is still, right, a problem.
But the spending has been
Somewhere.
increased, and that's
It's like 1 to 2. They're trying to 2%
Double the
to
GDP.
2% in the next 5 years.
years, right?
which is a big number with given
Yeah,
the size
it
of the
is.
economy.
Well, and the deficit. I mean, Japan has huge national debt, and also, there's their pension because of the aging society.
Right.
They can't really support.
take money away
yeah.
from defense.
Would you like to say something, Kevin? I'm sorry.
So when it comes to national security, maybe people like to talk about diplomacy or military power and so on. But I think for the case of Japan, maybe one important factor is also aging population.
Right, it's hard for them to get young people in the army, right? Yeah.
So the self-defense force had to raise the
Minimum age
yeah,
or maximum age. Maximum age, excuse me. What is it now?
like 30 what?
30, 36?
I cannot
Okay,
remember
yeah.
exactly, but yeah.
Like I said, go to Japan, you'll feel so young. It's great. The GIs are 36.
I mean, and it's been the other thing with recruiting for the self-defense forces. It's been very unattractive to young people because they've been a not pacifist nation.
Right.
Going in the military was seen as like only for not the gifted, and it had a very shrouded image. That's changing, I think, but it's still very hard for them to recruit anyway. And now with the demographic shift and less young people.
Before we go to questions, I think one thing that we're experiencing, well, you were describing people living next to you, but also the tourism that you were describing with the Singaporean investment. There's a massive wave of tourism coming to Japan. I think this year they're projecting, is it 40 million tourists. I think Paris, where I live half the time, is 60 million. It's the most visited city in the world. But at some point, Japan
We'll reach that.
is catching up. And in fact, it's even going faster than the Japanese government expected.
Yes.
And they're projecting, I think, 60 million in a few more years. So
By 2030.
2030. So now what's important about that is Japan has soft power. It's something, frankly, that China's opened the borders for visa free. There's lots of flights. You can fly 2 hours quicker over China on Chinese airlines, and there's a lot of transit traffic through China. But Japan is naturally getting people who are coming and staying. And we can't not talk about manga and anime and all the waves of, even British companies making up fake Japanese names on clothing. And, it's the reverse of the 1980s when they had English in Japan. So there's a wave going on. We can also compare that to Korea, obviously, which is arguably even more impressive given its smaller size and the numbers of people who are absolutely fascinated with Korean culture. But Japan, something is happening in Japan, which is quite organic because it's not organized by the government. You can say the Korean government is actually quite aggressively getting involved in that wave. But why is Japan experiencing both this cultural wave and this tourism wave in your opinion?
Maybe
The cheap yen? I mean, the cheap yen is something.
Well, I was going to say,
Scots.
for the first time in most people's lives, Japan is cheap.
You can have a really nice meal in Japan, in Tokyo even, and change.
I mean, I've been shocked coming here to London,
Oh yeah,
how expensive things are, because I'm used to Japan.
right.
And you can go out and have a meal in Japan for, I mean, even with the recent inflation, of which there has been, you can still eat for, what, 2,000 yen? You can get a nice meal for 2,000 yen. That's £10.
For lunch.
For lunch. Yeah. Sure. Fair point. But I do think a lot of people are fulfilling their lifelong wish to go to Japan right now. And when you get there, it is an incredibly beautiful country.
That's right.
Unfortunately, everybody decides to go to the same three places: Tokyo, Kyoto, and the five lakes and Mount Fuji. I don't know where else would it be. Hakone. I don't know. There's a few places that are really, really popular.
Or skiing up in
Niseko.
Niseko, yeah,
The Aussies and now the Asians.
Nikko.
Yeah.
There are a few places, but I mean, Japan is extraordinarily beautiful. It is overly endowed with ridiculous natural beauty, and I wish the Japanese government would do something. I'm sure you feel the same, to spread their tourism out a bit, because people in Kyoto are very upset, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
over tourism.
Yeah. Like Barcelona, it's becoming a real issue
Yeah.
But they
already.
don't use water pistols in Kyoto yet.
So I have been to Kyoto many times to do interviews, but last time when I was there in April, it was my first time I couldn't afford to stay inside.
Central.
Yeah, inside Kyoto city. I had to go to next city to spend overnight.
And you guys both lived in Singapore for a long time, but there's a joke going around Singapore. There's only
I
three types of
could,
people.
I
in
could
Singapore.
afford to stay in Kyoto because it was a Chinese company paying for me.
Oh, there you go. Okay, that's good. No, the joke in Singapore. There's three kinds of people in Singapore: those who are in Japan, those who are just come back, and those who are going. I mean, and you do see this. It started after COVID. Interestingly, the Chinese wave hasn't really come back to what it was pre-COVID, partly the economy. But even without that, we're seeing these massive numbers, a lot from Southeast Asia,
But
as
for
well as
Japan,
America.
actually, to increase tourist number is very easy. Just Japan needs to relax its visa policy vis-a-vis China or
Right.
Southeast Asia, and then they will just come, right? So
Yeah.
So the people-to-people links, I mean, people ask this about China and Japan. I mean, government to government, very complicated. But at the people level, well, those who are moving there, but also those who want to go there, famously buy Toto toilets and take them in the plane back and so on. There's been a huge carry trade there for literally carry trade.
Actually, these lonely people, actually, many of these people had been to Japan as tourists
Right.
before deciding to move to Japan. So yeah, that also played big role. Yeah.
I would argue also, I mean, when I was first time when I was 18, and now I speak some Japanese, but at the time it was very difficult to navigate the Tokyo subway with different maps and so on, and tickets. And now with the advent of the smartphone and contactless payment, I mean, Japan is a much easier place to get around, right? I would say.
Yeah, much, much, much.
Unfortunately, we need to create more obstacles to keep these people out.
Well, yes.
There used to be many.
There used to be many, many obstacles. Yeah.
Yes, I found myself becoming quite sort of taking on what you might call the sort of the older generation's caution about foreigners, shall we call it, or xenophobia. When I see
Yes.
people not lining up properly for the Shinkansen, I do get quite upset, and taking enormous suitcases on board. And in Japan, nobody takes their suitcase with them when they go traveling. They send it.
Yeah.
And there's a fantastic infrastructure for sending your bags to your house, to your hotel, to wherever you want it to be delivered to, and it will be delivered overnight, and it arrives your bag free while you go traveling. Fantastic. Unfortunately, this message has not got out to many of the foreign tourists who arrive in Japan. And so if I take the train from Ueno to Nagano, and it is jammed in the winter with people with enormous bags and skis and snowboards, and you think, oh God,
Bloody foreigners.
bloody hell. Yeah.
are you also annoyed when your neighbors don't separate the garbage?
That's me. Yeah, it is very hard.
So you're really Japanized.
You need a PhD in origami to fold boxes. Literally, in my basement, there is 17 different stations for separating your rubbish, and you have
And
to wash
recycling,
every
yeah.
bottle you've ever used. Yeah, before you even put it in the right place. So.
But I do think over-tourism is becoming a big issue. I
Yeah.
think with the local Japanese, if the government's not careful and they don't manage it, it's going to slip into the more anti-immigration wave as well. Because the Japanese do follow the rules. And for all of us that live there, it's really nice to be in such a society where people are so polite, they follow the rules. There's a lot of social pressure to do that. The more you bring in newcomers, the more, destabilizing that is, which is why they're really struggling, I think, with, how to handle immigration and how to fill that gap. So I think, the ability to speak Japanese is becoming now linked to certain visas. And that's also becoming a big issue to how to matriculate people without destabilizing that. and I think further to the whole tourism, like there's one resort I think in Okinawa now that has Japanese prices
That's right.
and foreign prices because foreigners is so much cheaper, they're willing to pay prices. But I do have a real concern that there's going to be a bit of a backlash, and I believe it's the numbers. Is tourism now the second
Yes,
income generator for Japan? So I think there's this now love-hate relationship. COVID, where it went from like basically they shut the borders, so it went down to almost zero, and that's why I think the prices have risen so much too, because even with government subsidies, people suffered so much in the hotel industry. Now they can pretty much raise the rates and everybody wants to come because it's relatively cheap. So I do think that element is going to be a big issue for Japan, also because politically people don't like to talk about immigration because it's a domestic kind of touch point and flashpoint.
An interesting context also is that not many Japanese have passports. So in the other way around, I think it's 20% or something of Japanese have passports, which is lower than Americans, I believe. Foreign
Really?
students is down to, I think, 1.6% of Japanese students who go overseas. So we don't see much Japan or Japanese outside. We see the brands. We see people coming back with
Yeah,
stuff.
even
but-
though it's one of the strongest passports, right?
right, it
it's
has
visa
actually
free
the
for-
strongest
For
passport.
like
in terms of
140, I mean,
visa-free.
it's amazing.
Singapore and Japan.
Singapore and Japan now joint first for travel.
Again, those damn
My
Singaporeans.
kids all travel, they have Japanese passports, so, they love that fact they can go visa free to so many places.
Right, but it
I was
typically,
actually surprised even at Gatwick when I arrived. There was a special.
you could use the
Yeah,
E
yeah.
gate.
You're electronic, right? Yeah,
There are
yeah.
not many. There are not many. I mean,
But
relatively.
I'm curious what for Hiro, because you've written about this, is
I mean, just when I was in Japan last month, or was it
Last month.
last month, watching the TV news, and there's lots of stories about foreigners doing bad things in Japan. So foreigners involved in car accidents. On NHK Evening News was questions are being asked in Parliament as to whether Japan should stop foreigners being able to swap their driving license for Japanese licenses because they don't know how to drive properly in Japan, causing accidents. The next day or a few days later, there was a huge story about a foreigner who had bought a big chunk of land inside the national park in Yote-san in Hokkaido, and had cut the forest down in order to build a big mansion there without permission. And it was real national news, and there was a lot of anger about it. I know because my daughter called me from Kazakhstan. She had seen it on the internet and said, "Have you seen this story in Hokkaido about this person?" And it actually was a Chinese. It was a rich Chinese person who bought this land. And when people say there's anti-foreign feeling in Japan, it is really increasingly code for anti-Chinese feeling.
It may have been
And,
Korean before, right? Let's be honest. I mean, there's been a sensitivity about the Korean ethnic population. So it's very difficult.
But that goes very
Way back.
long
That's way back. But
Yeah.
the Chinese becoming the new Koreans in that sense, maybe. Right.
Yeah.
Please. But in your book itself has been, whether you like it or not, has become part of this debate, right? And as you said, the elections are coming up.
I would say, you just raised the case of Yote-san. Actually, I got my Chinese friend there just contacted me like a few days ago. He said, actually, those who did something wrong, actually, somebody working at Japan's construction company, and so I don't know.
They
you
blame
know,
the
true
Chinese.
I'm not
story
suggesting
behind-
for a
yeah, yeah.
moment that, I'm just saying that if there's a Chinese person involved, it then tends to be blown up into
That's
a
right. That's right.
nationalist
So
story.
so you are right, and I think there's this tendency in Japanese players that if it's involved Chinese nationals, then many people want to watch the news, and there's this ecosystem there.
Right.
So
Yeah.
well, I interviewed a lot of Chinese people directly, but these maybe reporters have no access to Chinese interviewees, and that's why maybe many times the story is one-sided.
Absolutely.
That's a good
yeah,
suggestion.
yeah.
I think you're very good, well-made point.
One area also is education. So a lot of Chinese parents don't want their kids to go through the very tough you know, Zhongkao, Gaokao in China. So they're sending their kids to Japan.
That's also a big topic.
It's a
these
big
days,
topic
yeah.
because a lot of the international schools that are opening are
Yeah,
either owned by Chinese or they're 90% Chinese. But you know, there is a big wave of investment into education in Japan. Even some of the British names like Rugby has opened in Chiba School. That's a Hong Kong Chinese entrepreneur who opened that. Others are happening around the country. So you've looked at this phenomenon as well. What do you see happening in education sector? What's the impact?
Again, I think it's also related to Japan's depopulation issue.
Right.
You know, there's big, you know, correlation or causal relationship because a lot of schools in Japan are suffering to
Depopulation. Some are
So
becoming retirement homes, right? Or-
yeah, so I know, for example, not so far from Tokyo, there's this private high school, and you know, in rural Chiba prefecture, and so they had to
Close down.
not close down, but you know, they need to accept a lot of Chinese
just to survive, right?
exchange like Chinese students, and the ratio has reached 50%.
Which has happened in some UK universities as well, actually.
Yeah.
Maybe we should take some questions from the floor. Was first person I saw. Former MP, right?
Thank you very much. Mark Logan, former Member of Parliament and Vice Chair to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Japan previously. So, konbanwa, minasan. I thought it's incredibly interesting. I do want to kind of center on Rupert a little bit and Hiro-san also, because I'm reminded about 20 years ago was an article by Shi Yinhong, professor in China, who talked about actually a new way of thinking is that Japan and China shouldn't actually have such a combative relationship. And I oftentimes, when I watch the BBC or I watch panelists or I read the Japan Times day in, day out now, and I'm brainwashed by what I'm getting fed there. But I just wonder, is there a different way to see the bilateral relationship between China and Japan? Does it have to end in animosity? And linked to that, perhaps what's happening domestically. I'd really love to read your book, by the way. I hope you have more than one copy with you so I can get a copy later on. But the Sansei-to and the Nihon Honshu-to and the elections recently in the Tokyo elections, does the domestic constraints mean that internationally, whether it's Ishiba-san or his successor in the future, does that mean their hands are tied in having a closer relationship with China? And do you think that some of those issues that are happening, which interestingly, I think London still has the largest population of Chinese students in the world outside China, the last time I read. And
city,
but we don't, as a city, but we don't have the same level of, I would say, aggro in British media in terms
food
of
was shit beforehand. So no, I'm kidding.
yeah, well,
Japanese
time
food's very
ago,
good. Sorry.
but we don't tend to, which is quite interesting. Obviously, there's probably different immigration patterns, but I'm just wondering, again,
Right.
because Japan's struggling with numbers and demographics and what else. How do you actually go about integrating the Chinese diaspora and other diaspora communities within Japan? I'll stop there. Thank you.
And well, Professor, you have a lot of Chinese students also, Waseda, which has very deep traditional links with China as well. So it's Chinese at Waseda. So
It's 90% of your students, right, in your English international students are
but within
Chinese.
that, China is quite a big chunk.
Yeah, more than half.
More than
More than
half.
half. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
So and you are somebody who travels quite regularly to China. You know. So how do you address the first part of the question on, you know, are we condemned to have the conflict, or is there a more elegant way forward?
You want to comment first? I will think.
Well, for the bilateral relationship between Japan and China, I think Chinese government want current Prime Minister Ishiba to stay in power, you know, and I know there was this idea floating around, you know, Xi Jinping maybe make a
Like a visit.
visit to Japan.
And could you give some context? So
sometime
he's
this
seen
year.
as somewhat friendly to China based on his own. life,
He's
right?
seen
Yeah.
quite I know Chinese ambassador to Japan said publicly that he supports Ishiba over
Which you're not
Takaichi
supposed to do as
during
ambassador, right?
But during the presidential election for the LDP last year. So
Right, so
yeah,
kind of intervening in the,
definitely,
okay. And that's because the alternative may be a more
yeah,
hawkish.
right.
Right.
So
I think your interest was more long term, isn't it? So your question.
5 years,
10
10 years.
years.
Because the assumption everywhere you read in the media panels is it's going to end in the conflict, but it's like the Japanese, or sorry, the Chinese idiom on the meat is that whenever these two fish go to war, the fisherman wins. And I think there's a winner of Japan and China to maintain this conflict. It's neither of those countries.
I mean, while you're thinking, I think with the military, there's, you know, the biggest constituency I understand for Xi Jinping is like, if President Xi is, you know, you have to keep the military happy. That's one of his biggest constituencies. So I think that element plays in. But certainly from the corporate perspective, you don't see really aggressive de-risking in China. The Japanese are very practical. They're trying to navigate difficult waters, but they want a good relationship with China. It's the big neighbor, the economic neighbor next door. So Japanese companies have formed joint ventures and are very still quietly, really still invested. They're not leaving China. So I think when, you know, what will, I think, be interesting is, and for you to think, is the longer term, how the influx of Chinese affects a lot of the domestic politics, and if that impacts that in any way. But I think Japan is really trying to kind of dance very delicately around the China relationship because the economic ties are so important and so strong.
I mean, Japan has long practiced this China plus one strategy, right? Which is you put a plant in China, but you also put one in Malaysia and elsewhere. And I think Europe is probably, it's interesting. In fact, we're going to Paris tomorrow, and you'll be informing a little bit how Europe looks at China, because we know, for example, climate change, you know, climate technology, China has advantages. US is trying to, you know, tariff the hell out of it or build a wall. But, you know, Europe is dancing around how they can have a different relationship with China while protecting security. And I think Japan's experience is instructive because, as you said, there isn't really any complete decoupling idea in Japan. It's unimaginable for Japan to.
I think it's very
completely pull out.
difficult with the reality of the geopolitical situation and just the commitment of Japanese companies to that market.
So that would speak to your point that there probably is going to be some logic. But
No, I mean, I think I'm right in saying China is Japan's biggest trading partner right now.
most countries.
Yeah. I mean, I think people forget that Japan wanted to open relations with China way before they actually did, right? I mean, it was waiting.
No way before. But
There was no way because America recognized the ROC in Taiwan, and but as soon as the ROC was unseated from the Republic of China on Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek was unseated from its UN seat in 1971, the Tanaka government? Tanaka government at that time was like full steam ahead. We want relations with China. So, and the business community in Japan has always been in favor of close relations with China, going back to the early 1970s. And so, I think there's always been seen this sort of natural match between Japan's economy and China's market and its resources, that all the things that Japan doesn't have. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, you know, the last thing Japan wants is a conflict with China. And I suppose if one was to take the slightly sort of more cynical or skeptical view of perhaps some people in America, it would be that, you know, Japan wants the best of both worlds. It wants to trade with China and be protected by America, as do most countries in Asia.
Australia.
As does all of Southeast Asia, even much more, you know, than Japan does. And that, you know, America is now saying it's time to pick a side, and no one wants to pick a side. However, I would say that I think, in my experience, and you guys can, the three of you can comment on this better than me, is that there is a generational difference in attitude to China in Japan. The older generation, I've interviewed many older people in Japan out on the you know, against the change of the Article 9, against the bases in Okinawa. These people are all very attached to the pacifist constitution and to Japan being a peaceful, non-aggressive country. But my children's friends are far more skeptical of this. And people in their early 20s now seem to be much, much more skeptical of Japan. They're concerned. They fear China and they're concerned that Japan is weak. But, you know, you tell me I'm wrong.
No. I think you're right. But still, I do not, at least for me, I do not think that China is really a military threat to Japan. I think what Japanese people, and I think especially young ones, do not accept is the kind of relationship that the Chinese government has to its people. And that it's interesting because if you go to China, talk to experts, and if they talk to Japanese, they often tell us we are all Asians and we should be friendly and you know, we should cooperate and then maybe defend our interests against US interests and so on. And in that tone, how they often want the order to be established in East Asia is kind of their illusion or dream about going back to Asia before the Europeans arrived.
The tributary system, effectively.
Yeah. And there I see the biggest divergence because for China, maybe the past 100 years was a century of humiliation. For Japan, that was a century of modernization and where Japan kind of gained a membership in the Western world and trying to assimilate to the rest of the world, right? So
Very different experience. Yeah.
but they think that's a fake identity, right? So we kind of fooled by the Western world to have an attitude against China. And I have to tell them, no, for you guys, it might sound non-Asian and double standards and we pretending, you know, to be white even though we are yellow. But Japan is an interesting country in that respect that it has this hybrid identity. And everything, the development that we've seen in the past 150 years, that's real and became part of Japan and Japanese identity. And I think that that's the most difficult part when we're talking about how are we going to work together with China and, you know, restore the relationship. Yeah.
Any questions this side of the room? Yeah.
Maybe I
Oh, sorry.
Can I ask
Hiro has a
few
point
words?
first. Go ahead.
So
Thank you, sir.
I think you're right. I think it depends on generations how people view China. The eldest generation, for sure, they have, for most of their lifetime, you know, it was weaker China versus stronger Japan. But like my generation has witnessed, you know,
The opposite.
yeah. And then younger generation, I think they take it as maybe natural, you know, there's stronger China. And also they are really familiar with Chinese products, you know, including TikTok and also Chinese mobile games and so on. So yeah, they have softer, maybe also like image toward China.
And they may know more Chinese people, right? I mean,
Yeah.
perhaps in Japan.
But on the other hand, I think many young people haven't been to China themselves.
That's right.
So
Very
that's
few.
also a big difference.
Right.
And also when it comes to Japan's view on China, I think it's interesting that I think Japanese people tend to see China from through historical lens.
Yeah.
You know, I think I went to a graduate school in the US. I think, you know, I learned that many sinologists,
Sinologists.
yeah, in the US, I think see China through different lens. For example, like structure, they see structure, or you know, or they view China from strategic viewpoint. But I think you know, Japan has coexisted with this big neighbor for a long time, and then there were a lot of interactions in the past, and I think so. That's why I think when the U.S. believed that China could become democratized somehow, I think there was some skepticism among Japanese sinologists or
They were right.
conservative. Yeah. And then now the U.S. is kind of determined to fight against CCP, but I think there's this kind of people in Japan believing China one day will again swing back. Now we are seeing this authoritarian turn, but 10 years later, 20 years later, things will change maybe. So yeah.
So, and we get a mic over here. Sorry, this gentleman here, and then lady at the back. Two ladies.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. It's a two-part question, one about bullet trains and two about Japanese literature, slightly different. So the bullet trains, I was in Japan 25 years ago for work. I remember a bullet train arriving on our platform in Tokyo 5 minutes late, and there was an apology the following day, according to our translators.
If they're early,
Very
they apologize.
rare.
Sorry? Oh,
Even
the
if
train,
they're early.
if they're
they
early as well.
apologize for the
Wow.
inconvenience.
So that was a surprise and very different from what you experience here, obviously in the UK. I think
Unfair comparison.
otherwise the newspaper wouldn't have anything else other than apologies in the UK. But I suppose it kind of triggered a question, which is about how much of a driver that is for the Japanese economy. Is investment continuing in bullet trains? Is it perceived to be incredibly important for Japan to continue to be as competitive as it can be? So yeah, one question about that, bullet trains, is it still being heavily invested in? And secondly, a question about Japanese literature. So I'm a member of a book club, and the book club can't move for love or money without yet another Japanese book, which we're compelled to read. And some of them are good, some of them are something in between. So a recent book, Butter, you may have heard about it, very heavy seller in the UK. So I'm curious, is that seen as a important feature of promoting Japan? Is it just us in the West who perceive it as being fashionable and interesting because there's a fascination or obsession with Japan? So yeah, one about bullet trains and two about Japanese
Who
literature.
wants to take the train?
No, okay, I can make quick response and maybe you can augment. So interesting, I recently learned that some of the Japanese writers and books are very popular in the UK and it's been translated, right? And some of these translators actually, they joined workshop and be trained at Waseda University, at my university, because my university is also famous for producing a lot of writers, including Murakami Haruki and so on. But I don't think the Japanese government ever had really a targeted policy on exporting contents industry. So I think that's very organic. That's my point. For bullet train, Japan is very strategic, and you probably know that JR Central is currently building a maglev from Tokyo to Osaka. It has been delayed because the Shizuoka prefecture, where it passed through, they had to dig a tunnel that's affecting the water sources, and the governor of the prefecture demanded investigations, and they stopped the construction process. But now they have a new governor, and I think it's still going to be delayed, but when it's completed, first they're going to complete Tokyo, Nagoya, and then Nagoya, Osaka, from Tokyo to Osaka in less than an hour.
1 hour.
Right.
So we're talking about 500
No,
kilometers.
it's 40 minutes.
40 minutes.
Yeah.
And
So
now it's
that-
about 2, right?
and that's like
HS2, anybody? HS2?
Yeah.
Sorry.
it's 500
Sorry,
kilometers.
you're right. It's 40 minutes to Nagoya.
Okay.
And I think it's
And
less
about
than
an hour
to,
to-
less than an
oh,
hour to
just-
Osaka.
Yeah, that's
which is-
about
it's about-
500 kilometer
It's
distance.
about London to Edinburgh.
And this is a commercially deployed maglev, which hasn't, I mean, apart from one small one in Shanghai, hasn't really.
Yeah, there the government is heavily involved because they're using the fiscal policy program. The government is subsidizing the JR Center to build this.
Yes, you, lady, and then at the back. Sorry, I'll start with you. Sorry.
Hi, my thanks as well for a fascinating discussion, particularly the China-Japan issues. My name's Caroline Deal, and I'm a social entrepreneur, a serial social entrepreneur, and I've just been living in Tokyo for a few months, back here now again. I run a network, a global network for founders of social impact organizations. So there's two questions I've got as well. One is, none of you have mentioned the startup culture in Japan,
Okay.
and particularly tech startups. I was very impressed. Where I was mainly in Tokyo, but I was also traveling quite a lot in around other places as well, not Kyoto, the cities.
Fukuoka, maybe?
Yeah, Fukuoka,
Quite
Osaka,
nice culture.
Yokohama. There's everywhere. There's tech hubs
Yeah.
and an incredible young generation. So I'd like to ask you about that. And then the second thing that I was incredibly impressed by was how passionate young people in their 20s and 30s, and actually even younger in schools as well, are about social impact. And I had been in Japan 5 years before, and it was hardly mentioned. Nobody knew what it was. Whereas now there are hubs everywhere. There is a lot of impact investment. There are governments, always there were sort of top government ministers speaking at events. They all said, by the way, the government ministers are all saying that Japan's biggest problem is that people don't know how to speak English. And that for business in Japan, they need to learn to speak English. So those two questions really, and a very quick possible mention about Africa, because I noticed quite a lot of people who are Africa focused in Japan, startup entrepreneurs, big businesses as well, rather than China focused. So actually, it's three questions. Sorry.
Oh my God. Who wants to tackle startups?
Well, you can do. I mean,
Well,
I
on the,
can,
yeah,
I
so
can
you
talk
wanna-
a little
I
bit.
mean, I think just for me, I think the governments, the prefectures, like there's been a huge focus on startups, and I think Medi with the foreign direct investment, et cetera, they're trying to do more English, make it easier, more accessible. There's more funds. We know somebody, Kathy Matsui, who set up a fund, to get startup culture. There's a lot more venture happening.
more women as well.
More women.
Yeah.
I think though that, and Duncan can speak to this too. I mean, I think there's so much more than there was before, but there's very few unicorns. There hasn't been a lot of true success stories yet. So while the infrastructure is being built and there's a lot more government money flowing, Sushi Tech, the governor of Koike of Tokyo is very focused on it. So they're really trying to attract startup culture, but I don't think Japanese startups have had a lot of success yet. And so maybe I can then, Duncan, I know you're involved in a lot more of the grassroots, and even at OIST, the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, where we were, they started a Friends of OIST, like trying to turn the research at the university more into actually viable investment. So there is a lot happening, but I still think it's quite small scale. The money's flowing in, but you haven't seen the success you've seen in the US and a lot of other places.
Yes, we haven't seen that many Japanese, certainly companies go global successfully in this space. But within Japan, I think there is a growing awareness. Well, one thing is that Japanese are spoiled for choice now. If you're graduating in Japan today, or it's April in Japan, you probably already lined up a job 2 years prior, because there's such a competition, I mean, for talent. And some of them will go into social entrepreneurship roles. But it's also important to remember that you don't get the same support, for example, if you want to buy a flat, or if the banks don't really like to lend to people who are not in the traditional system of working for Mitsubishi and so on. And even, salaryman culture. I mean, it's changing. I mean, it's no longer a job for life, but it's still helpful for many young people to have that experience at one of the big companies. So I think it is, but values are changing. I see that. And then to your point about, I have experience of a Japanese gentleman who's in Malaysia working on dyslexia. He himself was dyslexic. Came to the UK, actually, studied in Cornwall in arts, and actually has set up in Malaysia social entrepreneurship activity, which is now expanding to Indonesia, helping detect dyslexia early on. And he's not alone. I've met Japanese also in Ghana and elsewhere. So you're right, there's some very interesting, and Japan itself gives a lot of money internationally.
The Japan Foundation.
Japan
There's a lot of
Foundation.
actual outreach, and I know that even some people that used to work there, like somebody's in Malaysia doing education. I think you're seeing a lot more Japanese do the social impact, even in Southeast Asia. Maybe more than in Japan. I think in Japan, it's becoming more popular, but I think there's a lot of actual social impact then happening by
And with
Japanese
the end of US aid,
outside of
obviously,
Japan.
you just see it's interesting. I think you're right. There's a value shift, but it's a non-social entrepreneurship. It's still early days, but yeah, in Okinawa, there's this innovation lab. And the interesting thing about the university that we're attached to in Okinawa, the Institute of Science and Technology, it's an English language working environment, and 80% of the students there are actually international. If I'm not mistaken, we have. It's like a mini MIT that's funded by the Cabinet Office in Tokyo. So Okinawa may be an interesting halfway house, if you will. It's a Hawaii of Japan place where we are seeing this happening. So, but it is spreading. I mentioned Fukuoka, Southwest Japan. Don't also underestimate the effect of TSMC, the famous Taiwan semiconductor company, has opened 2 plants already in Kumamoto in Southwest Japan. So that Kyushu island is suddenly having an influx of people connected to technology. It's also more affordable. Young people like to live there. Actually, a lot of younger Chinese people like to live there as well. So Koreans, it's only a 3-hour ferry, I think.
A lot of stuff with environment.
Environment is,
Yes.
yeah. So
Agriculture.
I think you're right. You're onto something. I think it is real, and it has changed in the last few years. And perhaps COVID's had an impact. So the lady behind you, you raised your, yes. Oh, there was 3, wasn't it? I managed to get. Africa, some I've met in Ghana, but there are, you meet, actually one thing is in coffee. I was in both in Nagasaki and also in Fukuoka. There are amazing coffee shops in Japan, and they really do travel around the world actually, and then they invest very much in ethical sourcing of beans, and you know, Japan is the place for the most detailed analysis of anything, and the most, you know, the best coffee in the world you'll ever consume there. I mean, so they really mean it. I mean, they go deep, and it's very impressive. You know, you feel like a better person being around these people. You're like, oh my God, I'm just so slapdash. But in Japan, there is an attention to detail, bordering on the insane, actually, sometimes. But it's very good to be a consumer there. I would hate to try and compete with that coffee shop because the level of attention to detail is amazing. It's something that I think is part of the charm.
You want to talk about Africa? You said you.
I think the underlying tone, whether it's social impact or Africa, is that the Japanese young people no longer wants to work like their parents, lifetime employment in a Japanese company, hierarchical structure, seniority payment, and so on.
I can also talk about the LGBT community.
Yes,
One of our trustees at Asia Society Japan, and we're also on the board, is very active in Tokyo Pride. And actually, you know, he had the recent interesting experience that he was getting 2 divisions of the same large Japanese company competing to be the Pride sponsor in Tokyo. So talk about a different environment from some large countries to the west of here. So even in Pride, I mean, that's in Caroline Kennedy, who was the U.S. ambassador to Japan, joined the board of Asia Society Japan. And actually the first event we did when we launched Asia Society Japan was LGBT, bringing mayors together, talking about rights. I mean, there are some rights for co-parenting now. It's not there yet. But even in that area, we see Japan is taking strides. And certainly I feel as a gay person, I feel like Japan is, you know, there's more social conservatism, but actually at the personal level, it's been very welcoming. By the way, the best thing I would recommend, you go to Tokyo Comedy Store in Shibuya. There's some hilarious comedy, both in Japanese, increasingly, but also in other languages, and now doing in different languages, even Chinese for their community. And so it's wherever there's comedy, I think, you know, that's a good place to go. I'm trying. No.
Well, we always joke that just on the language issue,
Yes.
I mean, Japan runs the most elaborate English teaching program in the world, JET, which has brought, I'm guessing, hundreds of thousands of young native English speakers to Japan over the decades, including several friends of mine who had, I think it's been the most brilliant cultural exchange program, because there are now all of those tens or hundreds of thousands of people all over the globe who have this deep affection for Japan because of the year or 2 years that they spent living in a little town in rural Japan, and the incredible welcome that they've had and the friends that they made. I have a friend from university who I was visiting in Newcastle the other day, and she is planning to go back for the 30th anniversary of her time in little town in Nagano this autumn. So that's been brilliant. It doesn't seem to have had any impact on the level of English in Japan at all.
Gone down, I think.
And actually, and I think, you know, serving on boards too, I mean, one of the reasons, you know, it's good timing for me is they really haven't embraced English yet. So even on these, you know, large companies that are multinational, it's all Japanese reading, right? You know, so you're really limiting the diversity pool you can have at this time, right? With that kind of intense language capability. Hopefully that is changing over time. There's more companies that are bringing in some translators, but you know, Japan doesn't operate well in English yet.
But it's my kids went to the American school in Japan, and there were quite a lot of Japanese families who sent their kids to the American school. Rich Japanese families who sent their kids to the American school in Japan.
And what was one of my daughters was dating the son of one of these families, and his English was absolutely standard American English. And I said to my daughter, well, how come his English is so good? And she said, oh, they all speak English at home. And it's actually quite a famous family in Japan. Grandmother was the founder of a big makeup cosmetics.
Shiseido was
Not
not
Shiseido,
Shiseido, there
the
was
other
another one.
The other one.
Hanai or no, I don't know.
And in the 1950s, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the family had been educated in English and had continued to speak in English at home. I mean, it's very unusual, but there definitely does seem to have been better English spoken more widely in the 1950s. Maybe that era when people were going out.
But that's a very elite family.
Right.
Yeah, like my grandmother on the mother side used to speak English at home, but that's.
But I think because of the demographics now, you really don't have to, like a lot of people went abroad and learn English to have a different skill to be competitive in the Japanese job market. You don't need that anymore. You know, if you're, like I said, breathing, graduated from university and speak Japanese, you're going to get a job. So I think that differentiating factor in having English capability now, while nice, is really not a requirement. And I think that's unfortunate because I think you're seeing less people go abroad. More Japanese want to stay at home because it's stable. Obviously, the U.S. is not safe and it's expensive.
Right.
So I think, you know, that I think is a bit of, well, you want more English competency. I don't think Japanese young people are being really encouraged or feel the need to speak English for their career.
Well, AI is coming as well.
But that's my only way to reinvent Japan, I think, is to have more foreign direct investment and foreign people coming to Japan.
Who don't speak Japanese and then they have, no, I'm just kidding.
Yes, sir, in the front row. Sorry. Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
we're in the back, yes.
Oh, I thought you said it was on.
I think I might
sorry.
have a microphone here.
Oh, no, that's right. Sorry. It was finishing your neighbor. Sorry.
Hi, my name's Momoko. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu. My family's, I'm half Japanese, and I'm a foreign news journalist at Sky. I have a quick question, although I would just add quickly as a sidebar about the idea that in the 1950s, perhaps English was better spoken. My grandmother grew up in Tokyo, sort of during the war and post-war. And there were obviously a lot of GIs, Americans around,
Right.
and in Tokyo at the time. And my grandmother's, she's 94 now, but she speaks excellent English, and coming from a blended family, it's very helpful. It's really good. So I think there's probably some truth to that. It's all about exposure, isn't it, really, at the end of the day? My question is, as somebody who has grown up being half Japanese and English, and Japan has always been a core aspect of my life, my personality, all those things, I've definitely seen a sort of uplift in this sort of cool Japan phenomenon. It's back. Everyone loves it. Everyone's coming to me for recommendations. It's a thing. But also, obviously, whether it be geopolitically, the sort of shift that's happened post-Trump, or economically with the yen being weak and everybody being interested in going, that's obviously happened. Something that I've sort of observed throughout the years of being Japanese and being interested in Japanese politics is that there is such a distinct lack of ideological pluralism in Japan, and politically has been stagnant in a big way, not just economically. My question is, I suppose, all of these things seem to be happening to Japan, but I don't know how much of it has been motivated by policy. And is it possible that, yes, we're seeing a kind of boom and we're coming out of the shadows and all this is happening, but how much of that might be squandered by a lack of kind of like political impetus and a lack of kind of motivation from the political side of things? I certainly know that, I mean, my audience might be a bit skewed in that my mother is in her 60s and my grandmother is in her 90s, but my understanding of it from the sort of limited exposure that I have to young people in Japan, they're not that politically motivated. So how much longevity is there to this, is my question.
There's also the, was there a major impact of Abenomics, for example, in certain areas or not? That was probably the last big initiative.
Well, I think in terms of ideology or government policy, Japan hardly does things very top down. I think it starts at periphery, so for example, corporate governance and so on, I like to touch upon that because, and this is interesting because we have here.
I know this in the background.
The main bank system, for example, this is a product of wartime. when the Japanese government used bank to support industry that was important for war. After the war, when Japanese government wanted to reconsolidate the industries again, the Japanese government tasked banks to talk to important clients and reconsolidate the industries. And that is a continuity that you see from before the war and then after the war. But the bubble economy kind of is a clear sign that this kind of growth model has run its course. And then, you know, Japan has been struggling during the last decades to find a way how to transit to a new way of capitalism, market-oriented economy. And I think usually the needs arise from the industries and the periphery, and then the government reacts and does. It doesn't announce big things to change the entire landscapes, but it's very gradual, the approach. So even though you might not, well, I think I'm frustrated often too that Japanese government is not very agile, it's very slow, doesn't do things as dynamic as South Korea does, for example. But things are happening, and if you take a longer span of 20 years or 30 years, Tokyo is a completely different city from
Got rid of fax
how
machines,
it
or
used
getting
to.
rid of fax machines. That's a new thing.
Well, I mean, I think that what's really driven Japanese,
Steady.
I think they did get rid of those, but I think what's really changed in Japan is that I don't think it's been the politicians so much, but you have, you know, the entrenched bureaucrats, and even a lot of my American friends in the government, like 90% of the legislation is written by bureaucrats, not by politicians. So you really have, and if you look at even corporate governance, it was Prime Minister Abe really wanting change, but a lot of that was driven by people from the Ministry of Economics and Trade, METI, who realized Japan was the least productive of all the G7 countries. They've stagnated. You know, used to have Japanese banks and other companies, you know, as the top performers globally, and maybe the top 50 companies really changing. So they felt for stagnation, diversity, corporate governance was very important, and they were the creators of the stewardship code and then the corporate governance code. So I think even for what the changes have been around diversity, it's really been government driven, not really social driven. There was a lot of need there, but I think that the bureaucrats within the government have seen that Japan's falling behind the lost decades, and they really had pushed the reform. And that's why I think it's a very different model than a lot of other companies where you've seen it's a much more social grassroots, women wanting to work, et cetera. But even after the corporate governance code, I got my first board position in 2015, it was about 2% of women on boards, and now that number's the prime market, the highest level, about 17%. So Japan's slow, but that's still fairly not revolutionary, evolutionary. But I do think that there is a movement within the bureaucracy of the government. They do see a need, and there's been a lot of concern in technology that Japan has fallen behind, and they are trying to push the needle now. And I think that fortunately, Prime Minister Abe had more of a vision. I think other prime ministers have been more reactive. But as long as you have, I think, this bureaucracy that's really aware, and even the Tokyo Stock Exchange, a lot of the changes they've made, capital efficiency, this is all rule imposed. Okay, you got companies, you're not improving your balance sheet. Your capital usage isn't good, so we're going to make you disclose it. So a lot of this has been disclosure and other requirements that have come from really the government directives to make Japan more competitive. So I do think that's been an element that's important.
3, 2, 1. I don't want to be making apologies for being late, but we're hitting the 90-minute, and we
geez,
have a
we've been
reputation to.
Yes.
One final comment from each of you. Yeah.
So can I just comment on that? My experience recently is of rural Japan, and the monopoly of politics by the LDP in rural Japan, where it gets a lot of its votes from.
Yeah.
I would say is problematic in that rural Japan is populated by elderly people who vote LDP because the government in Tokyo continues to keep the money flowing into rural towns to build often
Unnecessary,
pointless things.
Yeah.
And what that creates is a political environment or a local environment which is hostile to change.
And what I've seen in the town where I spend a lot of my time, and the business people that I know there, the young people trying to come in and open businesses, is
Not well.
the older generation do not welcome them, and they don't want anything to change. And in some ways, they don't want a new things coming and a new prosperity being built, because they worry that the money from Tokyo might get cut off if that happens. So there's this absolute stasis in those areas. That's been my observation. You know a bit more about this than me. This is just anecdotal, but it makes revitalizing our town, as I increasingly think of it, very difficult, because of the domination of the LDP, but also because of the skewing of the voting system towards rural votes, where rural votes essentially count for more than urban votes because of the lack of redistricting that has gone on, despite the fact that the Supreme Court in Japan has repeatedly said that redistricting needs to take place. It hasn't taken place. And so, elderly rural votes just count for a lot, and that is a real barrier to change.
Could you run for mayor? Because we know there are foreign mayors.
If I became a citizen, I could, yeah.
So
yeah.
I and friend here together, we can work on a campaign. Any final comments? And I'll take your comment offline, sorry, because we're running out of time. But any final comments to wrap up?
Not to wrap up, but I want to maybe answer to the last question maybe.
Yes.
Regarding startup scene. I think it's interesting to see whether we are going to see Chinese business leaders in this circle. I mean, I think increasing number of Chinese people are going into this.
Japanese startups, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and they're doing well.
This is something to watch out for, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think many Chinese people don't see a lot of. They don't think there's a space to shine in, traditional Japanese companies. Who can imagine, for example, like 10 years later, 20 years later, Toyota's CEO is Chinese? Is it possible? I don't think it's maybe possible. So.
They tried French, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Well, that was Nissan. Sorry, that was Nissan. Sorry, don't mention that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Good point. So,
Yeah.
Don't talk about Nissan.
No, don't mention the mushroom cloud. Sorry, no. All right, I think we're running out of time. But I think any parting remarks? Otherwise, we can maybe huddle downstairs. And I just need to know what your question was. It's killing me. We'll give you a very quick one. Sorry.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. You've discussed a very broad range of topics, and the framing of it is leader or follower coming out of the shadows.
Right.
The one thing you haven't discussed is the one thing we know is definitely non-negotiable is atmospheric physics.
Okay.
So what do you think, is Japan going to be a leader or a follower when it comes to government regulation in relation to emissions control?
Emissions. Goes back to Toyota and their big bet on.
I think that, companies in Japan have been late to focus on emissions in those areas. I think sustainability now and impact is a big topic. And I think Japanese are trying to be practical with more transition finance. I think that with hydrogen, I think the Japanese government stepping up under Suga, which was the prime minister, they finally announced, they were going to net zero, 2050. So I don't necessarily see them as a leader, but I do think they're finally at least catching up. I don't know if that's fair or not, if you see them more as a leader. I think there's a lot more sensitivity, even with young people. I think there's a much more social impact awareness.
Right. I think there was I arrived in Japan just after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and under the DPJ government then, there was, in the aftermath of shutting down all of Japan's nuclear, there was a real push for renewables, and you saw a sudden explosion of solar panels going up all over Japan, and a pretty generous feed-in tariff at that time. When Prime Minister Abe came back to power, you got the sense that there was a desire to get the nuclear village back in business, and the feed-in tariffs were cut back. It has not been, Japan's nuclear power plants are not back on. So it's been replaced largely by imports of hydrocarbons. Japan's coal imports have gone up over the last decade because of so, in many ways, it would be a big step if Japan could get its nuclear power plants back working, or a lot of them back working, because they're already built and they have You know,
They only have about, I think 11%. I mean, Japan is really, I mean, only 11% of their electricity, well, their energy is generated onshore. So they have such a huge gap still to fill. But I think you're right on.
I mean, there's huge potential, right? There's huge potential in Japan because geothermal, wind, tidal. Japan has a lot of tidal potential, but it's just, you know, you look at the UK and you see the build out of offshore wind in the last decade and a half, which has been truly remarkable. I'm sure you would say not remarkable enough, but it's gone from nothing to what, around 30% of generation. Japan is a windy place too.
Out of the shadows, blown away by the wind. What a better line. But I wanted to apologize for the 5-minute delay of this service, arriving at Paddington. But thank you very much, panelists, for your incredible insights. And thank you, audience. And let's continue downstairs over a pint. Thank you.